Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about David Ireland's play, Ulster American. Now, I think at this point in his career, this is Ireland's most well-known and most successful play. Justifiably so, because it is very, very good. It's very, very interesting. I really, really like it. So the play is a meta-theatrical play, which can be really, really good or really, really bad. I have mixed feelings about them. But I think in this case it works really, really well because we have three characters. We have Jay Conway, who is an American actor in his 40s, very successful actor, somebody who's become quite famous, won major awards, etc., etc., and Lee Carver, who's an English theater director in his 40s, and then Ruth Davenport, who is a playwright in her 30s from Northern Ireland, from Belfast, which is also where David Ireland is from. So, we open with Jay and Lee, who are caricatures of the most insufferable liberal fucks that you could possibly imagine, right? These are the kinds of people who confuse who confuse talking about allowing space for women to express themselves with actually doing that, right? So they have this sort of long conversation about how it's important for men to step aside and let women express themselves, let women writers take the lead, let women writers tell their own authentic stories, etc., etc. But this always comes with this implicit caveat that they want to allow that as long as the stories that women are telling please them, or adequately sort of recognize their role in creating space for women's voices. And these are the kinds of liberal fucks who can talk themselves into the most horrendous things, right? Like, Jay makes this, I think it's Jay who makes this argument, Jay the American, remember? Jay makes this argument that white people not only should be allowed to say the N-word, but should say it all the time, on the basis of an argument put forward, he claims, at least by James Baldwin. And I don't know this argument by Baldwin. It may be true. It does sound like the kind of thing that he would say, but I don't think he would mean by it what Jay is taking him to mean by it. Right, so in his sort of, I am so stridently anti-racist that I should be saying the N-word, we get this sense of like, okay, these are the kinds of people we're dealing with here, right? So while talking about how incredibly feminist they are, they do have a discussion about what woman they would rape if they were forced to, right? Is this sort of insane bullshit? Which is, of course, a caricature, but it's a caricature because it plays up certain elements of cultural liberalism in the West, in countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, etc. Then Ruth Davenport arrives. She is from Northern Ireland, and what neither of them seem to understand is what she's actually doing. And I mean that on a very sort of fundamental level, right? Like, the framing, one of the frames that they've set up for this play, for one of the frames that Lee and Jay have set up is, we want to allow women to express their own truths, to tell their own stories in their own way, etc., etc. The play that Ruth Davenport has written, that Lee is directing, and that Jay is starring in, that opens the next morning, is about the Troubles, and the protagonist of it, whom Jay is playing, is a Protestant unionist, former, I guess, technically member of one of the paramilitaries, probably the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, because that's the one that that Ruth specifically mentions, although she doesn't say explicitly that he was a member of the UVF. And neither Jay nor Lee realized that. So Jay, who makes a lot of his Irish American heritage, his Irish Catholic American heritage, is horrified when he learns this. And it's interesting because the opening speech of the play, which we hear Jay sort of practicing a couple of times in his very bad Belfast accent, is about wanting to murder Fenians. Now, I'm partially Irish American. The one ancestor we know of who came over from Ireland came around 1720-ish from Antrim, which does make it very difficult to tell whether he was Irish, whether he was Scots-Irish, and therefore sort of lowland Scots Presbyterian, whether he could have even been English, right? With a name like David Moore coming from Antrim in 1720-ish, boy howdy, does that make it hard to tell which of the three sort of major ethnic and religious factions of Ulster he was a part of. But it doesn't make a difference. In the community that I grew up in, there was a pretty decent Irish American population, like long-term Irish Americans, not like first generation, second generation, whatever it is. But I think it was fairly common knowledge that the term Fenian did not refer to the British. So the fact that Jay has read this script over and does not realize that this is a Protestant unionist who wants to kill Irish Catholic Republicans, that's a reading comprehension issue right there. But Lee also doesn't seem to realize this, right? So this is one of the most interesting things about the play, is that Ruth insists, quite rightly, that she's British. And Lee insists that she's not. Lee insists that she's Irish. So there's this is first sort of introduced when Jay is sort of asking for clarification about the script. He says, so on page 35, this line puzzles me. Ruth says, which one? Jay says, when Tommy says he's British. Ruth says, uh-huh. Jay says, why does he say he's British? Ruth says he's British because he is British. Jay says, but why would an Irishman call himself British? Ruth says, because he's a unionist. Unionists call themselves British, like me. I'm a unionist. I'm British. Jay says, you're British? Ruth says, yes. Jay says, but you're Irish. Ruth says, no. Jay says, no what? Ruth says, no, I'm not Irish. I'm British. And it goes on like this. And Lee has all of these really interesting bits where he's like, Yes, well, okay. I know that's a thing you say, Ruth. I know you call yourself British, and you're in some way part British, perhaps in historical terms British. Um, and Ruth has to sort of keep coming back to this. Northern Ireland is part of Britain. Well, okay, so this is a sort of tricky issue. It's part of the United Kingdom. So there's an argument that Britain is England, Wales, Scotland, and it's the Isle of Britain, and the Isle of Ireland is a separate place. But the United Kingdom is England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. No contest about that, right? Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. The question then sort of becomes, can a Northern Irish unionist who sees themselves and identifies themselves properly as part of the United Kingdom say that they are not Irish? And so this becomes the interesting sort of thing with Ruth's perspective, is it becomes mutually exclusive. I am British, therefore I'm not Irish. And for people in Northern Ireland, those can be very coded terms. I think increasingly it's not as much, but Britishness means unionist, means Protestant, means opposition to unification with the Republic of Ireland. And Irish means Catholic, means means Republican, means support for reunification. For me, these two identities would not be mutually exclusive, but I also am not from Northern Ireland. I don't have a say in this, right? In the way that people in Northern Ireland identify or conceptualize their national identities. But for Ruth, these are clearly mutually exclusive. And for Jay, there is this sort of patronizing sense of, yeah, you might think you're British, but real British people like me know that you're not. And so it becomes this sort of difficult thing, right? Like, and this becomes central to the play, how they identify the play, how they identify themselves and their ethical objectives with putting on this play. Because Lee sort of characterizes himself as this champion of Irish playwrights, of Irish plays, of Irish art. And while Ruth is from Northern Ireland, she does not identify as Irish. And so that becomes this sort of insurmountable barrier of she is unwilling to be identified as Irish so that he can maintain his view of himself as a promoter of Irish theater. And he is unwilling to accept her as British so that he can maintain that he is a promoter of Irish art, right? So it becomes this, and then of course Jay is in the mix here as well, driving a lot of this conflict because he very strongly identifies with his Irish Catholic heritage. And so he was jazzed to do the play as long as he thought that the character was an Irish Catholic who was fighting against the British. But once Lee and Jay find out that this is a Protestant unionist who wants to kill Irish Catholic Republicans, suddenly the idea of we as white men need to step aside and allow women and people of color and whatever it is to express their own truths, suddenly that goes out the fucking window, right? And the goal for both of them becomes, let's rewrite this play. And Ruth flat out refuses. And so this drives a lot of the conflict, right? Is that Ruth is attempting to express her own story. And she has this monologue here. Because the thing that Lee keeps sort of suggesting is like, oh, this is just art. It's a sort of academic interrogation of this desire to murder Irish Catholics. Ruth isn't supporting that. And Ruth says here, I think my feelings are quite complicated about this, and I think the play is complicated about this subject. I think in the context of Northern Ireland, it's hard to say that the murder of innocent people was always wrong. The UVF did murder many innocent people, innocent Catholics, which was a deliberate strategy to terrorize the nationalist population, who weakened support for the IRA, who were also engaged in a campaign of sectarian murder. Now, the British government, the British Army, had no vested interest in protecting working-class Protestant communities from IRA attack. We were completely vulnerable. While the UVF undoubtedly behaved monstrously, they murdered the innocent, they murdered children. In the case of the Shankill Butchers, they hacked limbs from bodies, they decapitated so-called innocent Catholics, disemboweled them, as Tommy does in the play. But if they weren't there, what would the IRA have done to us? They were our last line of defense, the Protestant community's only line of defense against one of the world's most well-organized, well-funded, ruthless terrorist machines. Funded, I might add, in large part by wealthy Irish Americans like yourself, Jay. So, I think there is a serious ambivalence here. And I think it's one that Ireland himself experiences as a Northern Irish playwright working in Britain, in London, Glasgow, elsewhere on the island of Britain itself. This sort of sense, as a Northern Irish Protestant unionist, there is this sort of sense that that Northern Ireland and the union with Northern Ireland is as Lee says in the play, a sort of embarrassing remnant of colonialism that most English, Scottish, and Welsh, or at least English people, would kind of prefer didn't exist. Like it's a problem that they would prefer they did not have to deal with. But there is no way of not dealing with it because it is a situation that exists. And the future of Northern Ireland, whether it is to remain in the United Kingdom, whether it is to be absorbed in some form into the Republic of Ireland, or whether it's to become an independent country, the problem of Northern Ireland with its competing political, religious, and sectarian divisions, which are admittedly, thankfully, much less violently opposed to one another than they were prior to the Good Friday Agreement, but they still exist. They still define the country in some ways. And that problem will have to be dealt with. And it probably will have to be dealt with in a continuing way, right? There's probably not going to be one solution to the existence of Northern Ireland and to the fate of the country. Right? It will probably have to be negotiated periodically. Yeah.